Well, welcome to this digital chamber event where we're talking about voting and what it feels like in the new pandemic world. I'm really excited.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jonathan. Let's just give folks like 1 or 2 minutes.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. I'll tee this up for you. Jonathan will be moderating our first session. Jonathan, let me just give folks 1 or 2 more minutes. We have 2 sessions today. We have a fireside chat and we have a panel. We've got a really amazing group of experts organized to discuss an incredibly important conversation for all Americans around voting. Okay, well, with that, we'll get started. Welcome to today's webinar. Beyond the pandemic, has voting changed forever? My name's Perry Ann Boring. I'm the founder and president of the Chamber of Digital Commerce. If you're not familiar with the Chamber, we are a trade association representing companies that are innovating with blockchain technologies. And we strive to be a resource to government, policymakers, public sector stakeholders as they're navigating through this new and exciting technology frontier. Today's discussion centers around one of the most important constitutional rights we all have as Americans, voting. And it's not only our right, but it's our responsibility to vote. And unfortunately, participation in many elections, particularly in local elections, remains dismal and is significantly below rates that we've seen in other countries, in other developed countries. And over the past 2 decades, the US has had to reckon with a number of just inherent flaws in the election infrastructure and the processes around them. We can't forget what happened in the 2000s with the hanging chads, in 2016, the interference, and today we are scrambling to implement vote by mail in time for the November election. With the advent of COVID-19, it's highlighted an acute and a pressing need to develop new ways of voting, especially solutions that can withstand unforeseen circumstances to critically address election security, voter accessibility, and our health, all while upholding the integrity of the results. And these solutions will necessarily require the responsible integration of technology. But how? As we learned from a recent hearing in the US House of Representatives, the broad consensus was that yes, now is the time to explore remote voting options that leverage technology. So in today's conversation, we've got a pretty rare and unique opportunity as we explore this critical question of our time. We've got an amazing group of experts lined up. We have a member from the US House of Representatives. We have a Secretary of State here, cybersecurity experts, voting experts, technology experts, and other election officials as we explore the current state of voting, how the pandemic is shifting election operations as we speak, the successful use case of smartphone voting that's emerged in just the past 2 years, and what to consider as we look towards the future of voting. So our first session is moderated by Jonathan Johnson. Jonathan is the CEO of Overstock.com, which was one of the very first public companies that blockchain enabled their payment options. He's also the president of Medici Ventures, and he is joined this is a fireside chat he'll be moderating between the co-chair of the Congressional Blockchain Caucus, U.S. Representative Darren Soto, and the West Virginia Secretary of State, Mac Warner. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you, Perry Ann, and thanks to everyone who's on. I'm really excited about this conversation. Some of the themes I'd like to discuss are what are we doing about the election in a time when going to the polls poses a health risk? What's the role of technology in voting in this new paradigm? What are our leaders doing on the ground? And in many fields, we're witnessing unprecedented scientific technology and humanitarian collaboration. How does that apply to the evolution of how we vote? So let me first introduce our fireside chat panelists. Mac Warner is the West Virginia Secretary of State. He's serving in his fourth year as the West Virginia's Chief Election Officer. He's a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, West Virginia University School of Law, and holds a master's degree in international law from the University of Virginia and the U.S. Army War College. Prior to serving as Secretary of State, Secretary of Warner devoted 23 years of service to the United States Army before retiring at the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. After his retirement, Secretary Warner spent 5 additional years in Afghanistan with the U.S. State Department. And I love this picture. While in Afghanistan, Secretary Warner and his daughter, Lieutenant Lisa Warner Miller, learned how difficult it was for deployed members of the military to cast an absentee ballot by mail. He set out to find a way to ensure that military men and women could cast a ballot and vote in every election. Congressman Darren Soto, let me introduce him and then we'll get to the questions. Congressman Soto was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 2016 and represents Central Florida after serving for a decade in the Florida legislature. He began his career in politics at the age of 29 and is a proud graduate of Rutgers University and George Washington University School of Law. Representative Soto, my father is a GW law grad, so we share that association. He's the first Floridian of Puerto Rican descent to serve in Congress and co-chairs, as Perry Ann mentioned, the Congressional Blockchain Caucus, which has grown to 17 members with near even representation on both sides of the aisle. Representative Soto's view is that blockchain might be the most secure solution to many of the logistical challenges the federal government faces, including tracking and transmitting data. So let me start with you, Secretary Warner. Let's get right down to it. I know you've implemented a major reform when it comes to elections in West Virginia. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, sure. First, thanks to the Digital Chamber of Commerce for hosting this event. And what a timely topic as we all are entering into the general November 3rd election. What West Virginia has done is we've reached out. The key to our perspective is providing voters options. And so one key component of that to those people at the far fringes of the world, mainly our military in deployed situations on the hillsides of Afghanistan, in submarines under the polar ice cap, perhaps even astronauts out there in outer space. By the way, a roommate of my brother's and mine from West Point is heading up in the next space shuttle. That's why I mentioned that. But those are examples of how people who rely on the traditional means, say the U.S. Postal Service, to cast a ballot are going to be disenfranchised, as we saw with the COVID-19 in this primary election. 180 countries had their postal service disrupted due to the pandemic, actually stopped in many cases. So if you were a West Virginia citizen serving overseas, or a student, or somebody, say, working at one of our embassies, you would have been disenfranchised. Your vote would not have been able to reach the county clerks in time. So that's why West Virginia in 2018 led an electronic voting option, and it was very successful. We had people from 31 countries, and we're a small state, 1.2 million registered voters, and we had people from 31 countries who were able to cast a ballot electronically. That was so successful that just this last year, our legislature, in a bipartisan effort, unanimous vote, both parties said, we're going to extend that to voters with certain disabilities. So people who cannot reach the polls due to their physical disability can also vote electronically. So we can talk more about that, but that's just a quick overview of how West Virginia has taken the initiative to allow people to vote electronically.
Thank you, Secretary Warner. You know, I can't imagine a more important group to have vote than our military. They're defending our rights to vote, and we make it so hard for them to vote. I'm glad that you've been on the cutting edge in doing that. Representative Soto, you live in Florida, which unfortunately is a place that's notorious for hanging chads and the current outbreak of COVID. What are your thoughts on the election this year, and how do we both secure it, but also enable the safety when it comes to those voting?
Well, first, that's the hanging chads. I was still a senior in college when that happened. You're gonna have to give me a pass on that one. I can tell you, though, that we did get to work on modernizing Florida's election system. Many of those reforms were still going on by the time I got into the legislature in 2007, including having machine counted paper ballots that you fill out the circle rather than having any of these old hanging chad machines. So we've revamped that. When we look at the coronavirus pandemic that we're facing right now in all states, and July was a tough month for Florida, as you mentioned. We've gone down quite a bit since then, but it's, we're the third most populous state in the union, and South Florida in particular, I represent the Central Florida area, was particularly hard hit by it. We expect 60, maybe even 70% turnout in vote by mail, both in the primary and in general elections. You do not need an excuse in Florida, and we see it very popular with both parties historically for many years. And so now there's still a paper ballot, so there's no issue about afterwards doing the audits that I know Secretary Warner has to do a few days after the election and others to make sure that the results that are announced that night comport with the samples they do from the paper ballots themselves. But the key is there's always a concern about fraud, and there's always a concern about how to get folks who are not in state but are Floridians their ballots. And Florida for several years now has accepted ballots via email by our service members. And I concur with both of you that it is one of the greatest duties of each state and of the federal government to ensure that those who serve and defend our country are not disenfranchised. I couldn't think of a more disgraceful thing for what we ask of all these folks out across the world serving in various different capacities. So the question is, how do we make sure that that's safe? And that's where utilizing blockchain technology with it being a fixed ledger can ensure that accuracy and that it can't be changed afterwards, like it's done with so many transactions that we see in cryptocurrency. We allow for online registration in Florida, but there's no online voting outside of these specific cases with military veterans. So that would be a great place to start, like Secretary Warner's doing in West Virginia, and see how that fares as we ramp it to a bigger program. In the meantime, what we're also doing is there was over $400 million in grants to the various states to be able to assist with the upcoming election. And there's more money in the HEROES Act, $25 billion to be exact, for the post office to assist them. The current offer is around $5 billion. The $25 billion would have been over several years to help them out. That would be just for this year. But clearly there will be an increasing role as we get to more electronic ballots for those who can't get there. And blockchain will be that stabilizing factor to keep the integrity of our elections.
Thank you. Representative Warner, I want to draw on two things that, or Secretary Warner, two things that Representative Soto said. One, he talked about auditing votes, and part of your role as the chief election officer in West Virginia is to be able to audit votes. As you've used mobile voting, has there been an ability to audit and even have a paper audit? And then the second question I want to ask you is, Representative Soto talked about Congress appropriating more to help in voting. I know that you've sent open letters to congressional leaders, as well as the Secretary of Defense, and calling on them to do more. Talk to me about both those things, ability to audit and your desire to what Congress can do.
Sure. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to address both those. First, the audit piece. There are two systems that one we used in 2018, and that was an app-based system. And then now we're using a web-based system, but both of these are excellent programs, and they both provide that auditability that you refer to. And that's the idea behind a pilot. As you start and you see if there are any, how it's received, any technical glitches and so forth. So in 2018, we had that ability by way of when the voter cast the vote using the app, emails went out. One came back to the voters so they could see what they actually voted. One went to the Secretary of State's office, mine for auditability purposes. And then the third went to the county clerk, which would be printed off and then count just like any other ballot. And since that time, they've even added a secure component to this. So this can all be done with anonymity, so that maintains the secret ballot. The same thing goes with the web-based program that we're doing right now. Think about being able to be transported into the cloud, and then a third-party auditor could compare the vote that was cast with the vote that was received and ensure that there was no man-in-the-middle attack and so forth. So we're overcoming some of the objections that were originally cast upon this by MIT and the University of Michigan and various other players out there. We've overcome that, and now it's time for that acceptability to take place, and it is. It's gaining more. These systems are being tried in more and more locations. It's now about a handful of states and some municipalities where this is occurring, and so that auditability is a key component of it. Know that is in place now. The second part of the question, if you'll remind me what that was.
It was, you've sent an open letter to Congress.
Sure.
Defense Secretary, what are you asking Congress to do, and why is this important?
Well, they're talking about the hundreds of millions of dollars. I think that 10 or 20 million of that could be set aside and go towards expanding this pilot program. We're allowing it for voters, soldiers from West Virginia. I think all DOD soldiers should have this opportunity. Unfortunately, the FAP, the Federal Voter Assistance Program, prides itself on informing people of the right to vote and the process to vote. I make the analogy to Mark Twain's, the difference between, the right word is the difference between lightning and lightning bug. Just telling somebody the right is like the lightning bug. Giving them that right, giving them that opportunity to vote, that's lightning, that's powerful. And that's what I'm about with the electronic voting. I want to give that soldier on the hillside in Afghanistan the ability to vote. It's hard to transport a piece of paper via the mail. I went for about 6 months in Afghanistan without being able to send mail because of attacks and so forth. But electronically, we transport battlefield information via satellite, via technology, via the internet, and every soldier has that handheld device, whether it's GPS or other secure technology. And if we can do that, we can give them the right to vote using that same secure technology. So my request to Congressman Soto, and what I've requested to the leadership, both House, Senate, and then DOD, is to continue with this pilot program. We've tried it here in West Virginia. One quick example, a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa from West Virginia was able to vote electronically, and she was the envy of all of her other folks. She even mentioned a particular Peace Corps volunteer from Florida who said, how can West Virginia vote electronically, and we're a much larger state and we don't have that capability? We need this acceptance, and I think DOD doing it, as we've all discussed, giving that right and that power, that opportunity for soldiers to vote. If that was done across DOD, you have soldiers from all 50 states, and then those states can start looking at their individual laws and adjusting their system so they can allow their folks. And we need to start small. I think the soldiers is the right demographic, and once it's proven there, then you can use a wider audience, such as we're now experiencing with the pandemic. Had we done this 2 or 4 years ago, I think a lot of us would be voting electronically during the pandemic. But thank you for letting me address those.
No, it's great. And I'll note, I live in Utah. We've done some of this voting, both for military and military families and the disabled in Utah. It's really fantastic. Representative Soto, there was recently a House hearing with a big takeaway, and that was talking about exploring remote voting for members of Congress during crisis situation. This seems like a really significant milestone to me. I've long thought we ought to have members of Congress living among their constituents rather than living among the lobbyists in Washington, D.C. How do you think mobile voting, particularly safe, secure, auditable mobile voting, might affect the future of the body of Congress? Are there positives? Are there downsides? What are your thoughts there?
Sure. Let's start with sort of 2 points of context before going into it. One, ever since about 1994, when Newt Gingrich became Speaker, it became much more the expectation that members of Congress go back to their districts. And that has shifted ever since then. So for instance, I'm right now in Kissimmee, Florida, in 5 blocks from my house in our district office, speaking to you. And I love coming home. I live in Central Florida. So I can't wait to get out of DC after my job's done to come back and engage with my constituents. And that's true for most members of Congress. We spend about 50% of our time in Washington, about 50% home. And some people live in other time zones that can take multiple planes, so it's even tougher for them. Then 2 is that we're in a pandemic. And not only would it be irresponsible for us to all gather all at once in one big block for the health of members with pre-existing conditions and those who are seniors, but it also could affect national security if we had a huge outbreak of the coronavirus among the Congress and incapacitated the legislative body for the most powerful nation on earth. So we vote in waves and give the option for proxy voting. And so you have still around 80–85% of the members who are still casting their votes in person with that option even there. And we cast in waves. But that was important. First of all, the Senate was doing it already for a month or 2 before we started and doing hybrid teleconference hearings. You have the option to go to the hearing in person. You could attend from your office or otherwise via WebEx. And even the Supreme Court, talk about the most antiquated of the 3 branches. Even they did teleconferencing before we did. So it was really time for the House to do it. The House Republicans sued the majority. They got knocked out of court just the other day because it's a separation of powers issue, and we have the right to be able to make those rules, and it has bipartisan support in the Senate anyway, and most of the executive branch is meeting that way. So it's absolutely critical for the functioning of our nation. We proposed during the time period where Democrats and Republicans on the Rules Committee were making a determination on proxy voting to use a blockchain system. While it was not accepted because they really wanted to rally behind a form of voting that's been utilized many times in American history before, proxy voting, which is much more just person to person. Someone can hold as many as 10 proxies, although no one's holding 10 proxies right now in the Congress because most people are voting in person still. But it was considered, and the committee staff is reviewing it as a way to remote vote. Right now, though, it's done by email per vote to the member who is the proxy holder. And usually people are holding 1 to 2, 3 proxies at max right now, based upon my experience. So at least Congress is starting to consider those things. The issue of progress in the blockchain area in Congress isn't a partisan issue. It's more of overcoming ignorance and educating their members more and more of the importance of this technology and ensuring integrity in internet transactions and voting and in other systems that we will come to rely on more and more. So there is some progress being made, but certainly there's still a lot of education left to go.
Thank you. Let me close by sharing an anecdote. I live in Congressional District 3 in Utah. In 2017, our congressman resigned and we had a special election in a closed primary. It was conducted all vote by mail. Some of the county clerks in this district sent out ballots, not just to Republicans in a closed primary, but to independents and others. Vote by mail can suffer from human error. In that election, our state auditor noted that the privacy sheath that was included in the vote by mail was see-through. Everyone that voted with the expectation of a secret ballot had that taken away. This can be solved with electronic mobile voting that is safe, secure, and auditable using blockchain technology. It's time to come to the future. Secretary Warner, Representative Soto, I appreciate you not just being thought leaders, but being action leaders as we look at ways to improve voting, one of our most sacred rights as Americans. And I think blockchain technology is one of the keys to doing this. So thanks for what you're doing on the front lines. Keep at it, and thanks for participating in this fireside chat.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate Secretary Warner and Congressman Soto and Jonathan Johnson for that fascinating conversation and really outlining the why. Why is this? Why this needs to be a priority? Why this matters? Who this matters to? Our service members. We talk about those who are serving our country need to have a safe and reliable way to exercise their right to vote. People with disabilities oftentimes are left out of this conversation. And also, appreciate Congressman Soto highlighting why this is not a partisan issue. This is about ensuring the appropriate technologies are deployed in a safe way so all Americans can exercise this sacred right to vote. So thank you. Our next session is moderated by Chris Stern. He is a reporter at The Information. Is COVID going to be the catalyst to change? We've been, living amongst a really historic moment throughout COVID-19, and it's really impacted so many conversations we're having on the national and international stage. And will that be an opportunity to move the dialogue forward when we talk about voting and voting technology? Our next session, we have an elections official, cybersecurity experts, voting technology experts from both the public and the private sector. Chris, thank you so much for leading this discussion. Over to you.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm glad to be here. And I think that's a great introduction. I wrote a story a little while ago saying, hey, we're in this COVID crisis. It was very early. It was March. If we can't figure out e-voting now, when will we be able to do that? In order to discuss this and maybe go over a couple of the points that we heard about the last 30 minutes, we have Amelia Powers Gardner, Nimit Sawhney, Amelia Fry, and Asia Labrie. I'll go through them. Amelia Powers Gardner is sort of at the heart of voting in the United States, and that she's a county clerk in Utah. She's a former engineer and manager at Caterpillar, and as well. Now she's the county clerk. She was elected in 2018. And during her year in office, she's pushed through a lot of election-related reforms. She piloted a mobile voting app that was powered by blockchain. And she also allows her voters to vote by mail. Nimit Sawhney is the co-founder and CEO of Votes. It's a platform that allows e-voting. So we're going to want to hear a lot about his point of view. They've run more than 67 elections at the state and county level, and including the first mobile voting election in 2018 in West Virginia. Emily Fry is the director of cyber integration at MITRE Public Sector. She practiced law and she worked with a startup through several rounds of funding. Her expertise includes critical infrastructure, national resilience, and economic impact of cybersecurity. Asia Labrie is the head of information security at Haven Life Insurance Company. She's a former VP at Goldman Sachs, also at Citigroup. She also spent some time at Citigroup, where she led a team responsible for inter-broker-dealer connectivity and algorithmic trading. I want to get right into it with Amelia Powers Gardner. Since you're really at the center of how folks vote. You're the valve that pushes votes one way or another in terms of how people can have access to democracy. Can you describe your experience with online voting and why did you take that route?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me, and I'm excited to be here to talk about the future of voting. I've had the opportunity to really be a pioneer in this space and push things that some of the other people in my profession, county clerks from across the nation, have hesitated to do. I was put in office to an office that was literally called the epicenter of dysfunction by our governor. I was elected by a large majority because it was such a mess, which gave me a lot of freedom because no matter what I did, it was going to be better than what they had before. So this gave me the opportunity to be a pioneer, and no matter what I did, it was going to be better. The reason we went with mobile voting is when I started looking at our overseas and military and our disabled population, the methods that they were given were unreliable. And they were given vote by mail, which we utilize for our domestic population. But when you start dealing with an overseas population, vote by mail becomes a lot more sporadic and really unreliable. The other option they were given was email. And when they utilized email, not only was it absolutely not secure, but it waived their right to a secret ballot. So now we've got our military men and women serving us overseas, and they've got two options. One is unreliable, and the other doesn't afford them a secret ballot. So I really looked at the mobile voting as a way to provide our overseas and military citizens, particularly those serving in the military, this opportunity to vote for the freedoms that they're preserving. Also, in the disabled community, the people with disabilities, some of them can't hold a pencil, and vote by mail wasn't working for them. So this really gave them the opportunity to cast their vote and to do so independently and with integrity. It was really a no-brainer for me.
Can you describe a little bit about how you decided to sort of the physical exploration for you as to how you got to trust a particular e-voting system and how you became comfortable with it, that it would work and that it was safe for your voters?
Yeah. So when I looked at those systems, what I was comparing them to was our current system. So what I really looked for was, do you have better ways of identifying the voter to ensure that it's really the voter casting that vote? And do you have more secure ways for them to transmit that vote than what we currently had? So we looked at several different options. And I myself am a fan of blockchain. I've been interested in blockchain for years and all things blockchain, whether cryptocurrency or utilized for the immutable ledger. And so as I evaluated different products, I was naturally drawn to the blockchain product. I actually met Nimit. Nimit made an appointment with me my first week in office, and came and showed me his solution. And it checked all those boxes: more secure than we currently have, more reliable, gave the people the opportunity to cast a vote anonymously and with integrity. And it utilized blockchain, which made me feel more secure knowing that we had an immutable ledger that I could audit against in the future to ensure that these votes really were being counted as they were cast.
Did you audit?
We did. We've done, 4 pilots now. We did the municipal primary, municipal general, presidential election, and the nominating primary here in Utah this year. And we have audited every one of those elections. Every one of those, we've had 100% clean audit come back.
And how does that compare to, say, a mail-in or a rather physical voting, in-person voting, in terms of sense of security with it?
Yeah, so for mail-in voting and for personal voting, we typically will audit about 1% of those votes. With the electronic voting, we've been able to audit 100% of those votes. So risk limiting audits are very common in the election world. It's something that we as election officials utilize to ensure that our vote is true and secure, and typically it's a percentage of those votes. We've been fortunate with these electronic pilots to be able to audit 100% of those votes and give us that much more confidence in the results of those elections.
Okay, I want to get back to you maybe a little bit later to talk about how those audits work. But Nimit, let me ask you, could you briefly describe votes and what you all are trying to do and what sort of the status is of the electronic voting industry generally right now?
Sure. Firstly, thank you to the Chamber for having us here. The first part of your question about votes. So we are the youngest elections company in the country, and our focus from the very beginning has been on mobility, particularly focused on utilizing all the advantages which a smartphone-based ecosystem provides. And so we've kind of led that space of letting users use that technology, get remotely verified by scanning a government issued ID, taking a selfie, and then using the biometric security features, the trusted secure element based features on the device to be able to submit a ballot, including, if needed, signing on the screen. So
Let
we
me just be clear. You're talking about people's personal mobile device, right? You're not
Correct.
talking about some device that is in a room somewhere. It's like people are down. Could you just describe the process of from start to finish about how one comes to end up voting over your vote system?
Sure. Yes. So this is personal devices. So the process is very similar to other forms of absentee voting. So just like you would register for absentee voting by mail, instead of using mail, if you're eligible for an electronic option and you decide to choose it, then you mark that in your application. Your county or local election clerk will vet that. Once they approve you, you then get an invitation to download the smartphone application on your iPhone or compatible Android device. You start with an email or a mobile number, and then once you've passed the initial onboarding, the system prompts you for an ID check. So you need to take a picture of a government issued photo ID. You can use a driver's license, state ID, or US passport. If you don't have any of those, you can use other forms of IDs as well. And then you take a live selfie. And what it does is firstly make sure that you are a real person. You're not, taking a video of another video or a video of another picture. And it matches your face to the picture on your ID. Make sure your ID is valid and it's just not fraudulent. And then matches the data on your ID with the data on the voter registration file for that election. And once all those checks pass, which typically takes about a minute, then your identity is digitized, stored in this secure element on your phone, or secure processing space on your phone, locked with the help of a biometric credential, which would be a fingerprint, a face ID, or a wearable. And then all the documents you've uploaded are deleted. At this point, you're ready to receive the ballot. So you get your mobile ballot, which is essentially the same you would get if you voted by mail or if you went to the precinct to vote in person. So you mark the ovals, and when you're ready to submit, you may be asked to sign an affidavit, depending on your jurisdiction. And once you do that, you submit, you get a receipt, you can verify your choices were recorded correctly. And then in the background, an anonymous receipt is also sent to the jurisdiction. And then on election day, a paper ballot is printed, and also every oval in the background has been recorded on a blockchain-based infrastructure. So once the paper ballot's printed, it has the ability to do an audit with the anonymous receipt, the paper ballot, and the data on the blockchain. So end to end, that's how the whole process works.
Okay, great. Well, now that we've heard that explanation, let me ask Emily, is that a safe system? Or do you comfortable with that? Is this a kind of do you trust the person can we trust the phone? Can we trust the network? Can we trust all the elements that make this into a voting system that democracy can trust?
That's a great question. Rather than talk about any particular system, I think what's important to note is that regardless of how good any particular system is, and we have several nice candidates in this space now, we still are dealing with two obstacles for all of these vendors. So what we really need to do is find a way forward for all of these vendors through two particular obstacles. And the first obstacle is that there's this time-honored tradition of feeling like I carry my ballot and I cast my vote in a personal way at a specific location. And there's a freight and a weight of tradition that we carry as baggage. Now, in other contexts, I might not call that baggage. I would call it an honored tradition. And the reason that I think it's becoming more like baggage is that we're dealing right now with a digital generation. And these are people who, they've grown up holding their whole lives on these devices, and they expect to be able to conduct all functions, including functions of dealing with the state, on digital devices. And so we're dealing with an influx now of a community that views that burden of taking time off of work and going to cast your ballot in person as actually something they want no part of. And so within the next few years, as that digital generation starts to become voting age, we actually need to find ways where the tradition of voting is just as honorable and just as noted and just as worthy on a digital device as it is in person. So what does that transition look like? We're dealing with some burdens of tradition. And the second major issue is that there actually, regardless of what I think, regardless of what Secretary Warner thinks, and regardless of what you think, Chris, the fact of the matter is we don't have adequate standards. So let's say that some independent person who's very well trusted in the system, asserts, I believe in these 3 companies as great offerors. Okay, well, what standards are you relying on to make that assertion? We're missing some standards here. It would reassure the entire ecosystem if we had some standards that addressed the basic baselines of here's your hygiene protocols, here are the special standards that apply due to the need to return a ballot digitally, here's the authentication body of standards that we're using for each individual in this chain, and here's our chain of custody standard, or some body of standards that we could then say to the vendors, here are 3 standards, have you met the 3 standards? And it would reassure our election officials around the country as they seek to move in this very logical direction.
That's a great point. I mean, the standards and is not something that exists now at all. I mean, Amelia, I'm going to jump back to you before I get to Asia. Amelia, if there was a standard, if there was a regulation of some kind that covered it, I have 2 questions. One is, what would you want to see in those standards? And 2, and maybe this is something we should talk more broadly, is that standard is it appropriate to set that standard at the state level, or do you want to see it set at the federal level?
Yeah, those are great questions. I have to agree wholeheartedly. I really think that the industry needs some standards. Out of industry, we keep hearing it can't be done. And that's just frankly not true. In an age where we can edit DNA using technology, we can also find out how to vote securely using technology. We just need some standards. Like Emily said, I couldn't agree more with that. I think number 1, we need security standards so that we can say these are the minimum standards that you need to transmit a ballot. We also need identity or authentication standards. As an election official, I'm responsible for ensuring that the actual voter is the one casting that vote. So if we could have some identity standards, some security standards, and then basic standards around the election process. Was this an anonymous vote? And was it cast in a timely manner? Was there only 1 vote cast? Just very simple things that I don't think would be very difficult to comply with. Just having them in a standard would be great. As far as those standards go, the way things work right now, there aren't really standards on a state level, but there's certification on a state level. Typically, what you would want is an industry standard or a national standard that is recognized by the industry, and that different states can then therefore adopt for certification of an election vendor.
Okay, thanks. Asia, we're getting into the discussion of standard and in effect regulation. Is how close does that get us to the end goal of folks feeling safe with e-voting? And when I say folks, I mean government officials, I mean people like Amelia, and I mean citizens like all of us. How much does regulation get us towards that goal?
I think that it is contagious, right? So if you can get a group of population comfortable, that population can teach maybe their children or their grandparents to then also get comfortable, right? Maybe that's not the best example of contagious, but I think there's a lot of education and training that will need to happen and can happen organically. And the standards are probably the first step. I do want to just also highlight there's another element to this conversation that I think is important, and that is the operational risk, where it's not just the attacker side or the fraud side, but how do we run elections and do that in a resilient manner? And I think that's something we're about to see happen this year with mail-in voting, with the numbers increasing, and something that electronic voting would be a solution for. going forward. Just want to raise that, and that's I think an important problem that we're going to need to solve.
Okay, I mean, Nimit, I've read and I've talked to people who say as soon as a vote touches the internet, as soon as someone's electoral preference is subject to hacking, it can never be safe and we can't trust it. What is your response to that? What is your response to that the internet just is inherently untrustworthy and there's nothing we can do to fix that?
So I think when people make those broad statements, I think they miss a few things. For example, the internet by itself was not essentially designed for security. The internet is it's like a highway. It's a mechanism to transport things. Security in this scenario is the responsibility of the application. So you can't really keep blaming, the transport and say, because the transport didn't have, XYZ, that we can't even build something secure on it. It would be very sort of disingenuous to say that. I think as some of the other panelists have mentioned, there are so many use cases where secure transport is happening because the applications who are involved there, whether it be space or defense or healthcare or finance, they've figured out a way to transmit data securely and in a manner which is immutable. And so for sure we can do that in the election space. It's harder because not only do you have to transmit it securely, you also have to make sure that the identity of the voter cannot be reverse engineered. And so I think applications exist with infrastructure like distributed ledger-based systems. I mean, even before blockchain became popular and came into the folklore, there have been scientific projects on immutability. And so I think you just can't claim that just because the internet doesn't provide that secure fundamental, just because it's a highway, that you can't run a secure application on it. I think we have so many examples out there. Secondly, along with that, we also hear a constant sort of companion statement that because it's all software, you can't trust software. And that also seems a little bit, far-fetched from reality. Granted, software can have bugs, but we also have what's called as a formal software verification process, which is used by the Department of Defense. It is used in the space industry. It's used in, when software is added to fighter pilots, fighter jets, our embedded systems. And so that same model is very applicable to software in any other industry. And so why not in elections? And so I think the technology to do this is here. The methods to make sure that we can transmit something securely and make sure it's not tampered with either during transportation or when it's at rest. And more importantly, the ability to audit the whole thing. So you can, like Amelia was saying, if you do it at scale, obviously it would not be timely possible to audit 200 million votes if everybody voted electronically. But if you can do a subset and get that mathematical assurance, just like what happens with paper ballots, then you can come to a very strong conclusion that the whole digital process is secure and tamper resistant.
There's a lot more voters than there are fighter jets. And so when you talk about going to scale, I think that's the big issue. And there's been, great examples of what Amelia's done in her state and what others have done in Washington and Colorado. But I guess the question is, yes, you can be successful at the West Virginia level where you're getting votes from a few hundred Army or military folks overseas or folks with disabilities. But what about a vision of ramping this up to tens, even hundreds of millions of people who vote in this country? It seems like that creates the attention of a national election that is very attractive to hackers and things like that. Is it simple of saying we can ramp this up to scale? It seems the scale is the problem.
No, that's a great question. I think ramping up clearly can't happen overnight. And so we have to do it in what we call as baby steps. So like you rightly mentioned, we started with hundreds of voters. So next step is to take it to the next level, use thousands of voters, and then involve other partners in the ecosystem. So right now, as transactions are happening on mobile devices, mobile carriers are not involved in the election, securing the election process. So the next really good opportunity would be to involve the major election carriers to make sure that when this scales up to, like you said, tens of and eventually hundreds of millions of people, they are the edge infrastructure. They are the ones who are going to get attacked, the ISPs, the edge routers. And so at that stage, you're looking at the national infrastructure, you're looking at a national conversation. And so it's no longer sufficient to say that a specific county or a specific state can defend its system. That becomes a national endeavor. And countries have managed to do that. Estonia is a really good example where despite daily attacks, daily threats, they've run secure online elections for 10 years. Granted, they're a small country, but they have more than a million people voting, and they've managed to do it. And so clearly, there's a way to secure the infrastructure. Our government services are all going electronic. Look at Singapore, Dubai, UAE, and so just like we would secure that infrastructure, we can secure the e-voting infrastructure as well. But it has to be done in baby steps, one step at a time, and eventually we will get there.
Asia and Emily, how do you feel about that? I mean, yes, in concept, we need e-voting. Yes, in concept, it is something that that provides a very elegant solution to a lot of problems we have, whether it's fear of gathering in an election place to vote side by side with other people. But it also, how close are we to ramping it up from small scale to the large scale that allows for the typical 2-year and 4-year cycle in the United States? Emily, why don't you take this first?
So recently I learned that the most northwesterly province of Canada already adopted, just as a wholesale matter, decided to go with e-voting for federal elections. So, to me, it says the driver is necessity. For them, the driver was necessity. The people felt that it was physically hard to get to the polling places. It was not a COVID issue. This was last fall. And they just were ready, and they had a need. They saw the technology. They looked over the different security aspects. And even though there are no standards, and the Elections Board of Canada was a little taken aback, this particular province went right ahead. So I do think we're looking at a number of years, and I think the drivers are the combination of necessity to ensure voter turnout, the necessity to make available the ability to vote when you are posted on a hillside in Afghanistan and you don't have access to first-class mail, when you are a disabled person in this country, and that is increasingly a more visible problem. We're seeing some good press about people who have genuine needs, who have disabilities and can't get out. And now this year, we're in a unique spot where this pain point of people feeling genuine fear. It's no longer a question of a few isolated populations with special needs. It's all of us have that fear, right? And is this a moment that can catalyze many, many years of slow growth? into a shorter period of, oh, focused, let's get these standards done, let's meet those standards, let's make sure everyone's comfortable, and then you have a bunch of states who actually want it, and those things coming together a little faster. My hope would be that we would be able to speak specifically about progress toward establishing a baseline for security standards, identity standards, and knowing who's meeting those before the next 4-year cycle. Sometimes I'm overly optimistic, but that would be my hope.
Asia, your thoughts on this and on
Yeah.
how close we are? What are the steps we need to take to find broad acceptability of e-voting?
So I think Emily's spot on with the drivers behind getting, moving mobile voting forward more quickly. I mean, with COVID, I think we're seeing a lot of new technology advances in areas that maybe we wouldn't have expected, like weddings and, voting licenses. So you see technology being much more palatable. I get asked by friends and family quite often, why can't we vote online? Like from a technology problem specific point of view. And I don't see the roadblock other than training, education, and then the tough, hard problem of implementing and rolling it out, right? And I hope by the next election, sorry, there's elections every single year, but by the next presidential election, I hope that we have at least one large city piloting mobile voting. That is something I am advocating and passionate about.
Amelia, can you describe what e-voting was like from your constituents' point of view, from the consumer point of view? Was there one group that was more comfortable with it, and was there any groups that had difficulty sort of figuring out how to do it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we sent surveys to every single person who utilized the vote. Now, once again, this is a very small demographic, but we sent surveys to every person who utilized the mobile voting, and we didn't find any major demographic. We have older couples that are serving service missions in other countries in their 60s and 70s, and they were able to figure it out and do it. We have military members that are just barely 18 and eligible to vote serving the military that were able to do it. We didn't have any major group. There may have been some that needed a little bit of help with scanning their ID and doing the selfie. But when it came time to actually cast their vote, they didn't have a problem with it, and they really liked it. In fact, right now, we're getting phone calls from military members and service missionaries from other counties in our state calling us and saying, hey, my partner over here, they get to vote on their phone, why don't I? And I have to explain to them, that's because your county isn't doing the mobile voting. And the question isn't, well, is this safe? The question is, well, why aren't they? Why aren't they doing this mobile voting? So from the user standpoint, it's significantly easier. They like it. They don't see a problem with it. We actually have a higher voter turnout with those that are eligible to use mobile voting. We have a higher voter turnout for our overseas citizens in municipal city elections, if they can use their phone, than we do from our domestic population who lives here and can either vote by mail or show up at the polls. We're a vote by mail county, so we mail every eligible voter who is an active voter, we mail them a ballot. And we have a higher percentage of people voting on their phone from overseas than we do from people right here in our county who we mail a ballot to.
And do you have any data on what voter participation was in year over year, folks who voted via their phones versus voted on physical or mail-in ballot of some kind?
Yeah, it was significant. We had significantly higher participation of those overseas. I'm just comparing overseas to overseas, try to be apples to apples, but overseas voters casting their vote by mail or email as opposed to the electronic voting, it's significantly higher. So for example, in the last major municipal election, our voter turnout for the county was about 35%. Our voter turnout for our overseas citizens that could use their phone was about 45%. Previously, theirs was about 11%. Huge increase in voter turnout for that population. I do know that the younger generations feel more comfortable with voting by their phone. We have a city here in our county that is predominantly a millennial city. They brand new housing, high density housing near a university. It's just predominantly a millennial. They have a higher participation of social media polls than they do that vote in their city election. And that city has asked me many times, can we please use mobile voting for our municipal elections? Because we'd have a higher voter percentage turnout. The only thing that stops me from doing that is the lack of standards and therefore a lack of state certification so that I can let them. Otherwise, this community, I would absolutely let them vote on their phones.
I'm confused. Why are you allowed to do it in other cases, but you can't let this community do it?
So the rules are a little bit different when it comes to overseas and military voters and disabled voters. Overseas and military, the federal government requires us, all 50 states are required to provide a ballot electronically to overseas and military citizens. 29 states require that we let them return those ballots electronically. So a mobile app works in that case, and it doesn't take the same certification as a broad usage.
Emily, we hear a lot about during the last few minutes about millennials are much more comfortable with this. They're more comfortable with online surveys. They're more comfortable with social media in general, and maybe they see voting as an extension of social media rather than a fundamental building block of democracy. But what I wonder, I also hear in different contexts about other things I write about, things like TikTok, where there's a lot of concern that the younger generation is very free and easy with their personal information, and that's and that other countries can take advantage of it because they offer it up so freely and in such a insecure environment that it opens up the U.S. to manipulation, not just of at the personal hacking level, but also influencing elections and things like that. So what is your reaction to that? Is there a creeping lack of a sense that data isn't as important as it actually is? Like, the young folks may not appreciate how important their privacy is, but there are folks over in the Pentagon and the CIA and others who are very concerned about it because they see it as an opportunity to open the door and manipulate our society and our culture and our politics.
So here you go down this path that unpacks some other very, very important issues. I would like to posit, for purposes of this conversation and consideration, that we are facing two co-equal threats as a nation to democracy when it comes to the elections portion of democracy. If we can all agree that elections are a fundamental underpinning of constitutional democracy, that means they must have integrity. In order to have integrity, it means both the actual technical details of the process must themselves have integrity and be trustworthy. It also means that the ecosystem and the ethos around the perceived integrity of the elections technology and process themselves are trustworthy. So when we think about the threats to that, we see a cybersecurity threat. Co-equal to that, we see a misinformation or disinformation threat. Both of these are important threats, and they do, and unfortunately, they exacerbate one another. And yet they can be dealt with in separate ways. What we are primarily dealing with during this conversation is actually the cybersecurity issues. We are facing simply a lack of standards for cybersecurity when it comes to this particular marketplace. At the same time, we are also facing a body of problems related to mis and disinformation. I actually want to separate those in this case because I don't want to burden a burgeoning, promising, technologically helpful offering with the freight and baggage of something that we've got to find other tools for. So let me just start by saying there's a very big difference between TikTok and casting a vote in a federal election, right? So I don't really need any credentials to participate with Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, Facebook. I can make up an awful lot of stuff. And to me, social media is an ecosystem that is essentially designed to be manipulated. What we need to do when it comes to both how we architect and how we speak about mobile and digital and remote voting systems is to be the opposite of that. To be an ecosystem that is designed to be heavily authenticated and trustworthy. So we're dealing with different tiers of a digital ecosystem, and we have to be clear which tier we're dealing with. When it comes to the mobile and remote voting systems, that is a special place, right up there with critical infrastructure operations, right? So we have very different standards when it comes to financial services, to running the electricity grid, to operating elections, than we would for simply engaging in social chit chat on TikTok, Facebook, Snapchat, Reddit. And we do need to be quite clear about that.
Yeah, I hear you, but I also hear folks saying, well, the younger generation's comfortable with e-voting, therefore we should go forward with e-voting. And I just wonder if we're skipping a step there.
I think there's something we need to add to that. Keep in mind that a vote not cast changes the outcome of an election just as much as a vote that's been changed. And when we are disenfranchising large groups of eligible voters, we are changing an election. If the people with disabilities voted at the same rate as people without disabilities in this country, we'd have 7 million more voters every election. Think about that. That means that people with disabilities are not being represented. We no longer live in an era where only white male property owners get to vote. We live in a country where every eligible voter, regardless of their socioeconomic status, their gender, or the color of their skin, gets to vote. And if we are using an antiquated system that leaves out single moms, or people in inner cities, or people with disabilities, or people under the age of 30, then we are changing the elections by doing that. No, we absolutely cannot compromise integrity, and we cannot compromise security. That's not an option. Like Emily said, this is critical infrastructure. I had the Department of Homeland Security in my office for 8 hours yesterday going through our systems step by step. It was like a 437-point inspection to make sure that we are secure. So we can't compromise that, but we also need to realize that we have large swaths of people that traditionally have been disenfranchised, including our men and women in uniform overseas fighting for freedom. They've been disenfranchised for the last 50 to 100 years, and that's just frankly not acceptable. So we have to move forward with integrity, but also realizing that a vote not cast changes the outcome of an election as much as a vote changed.
Thanks. Nimit, you are caught between a rock and a hard place, because on the other side, you have these millennials that I've accused of being free and easy with their data. On the other side, you have the folks over at MIT who seem to think it's impossible for you to produce a secure voting system, and actually derailed the election that you were about to run. West Virginia changed courses midstream because of questions that MIT raised. Do you think that are you fearful that the bar will continue to be raised because of the culture on the other side with cybersecurity experts who are fearful of anything that touches the internet being insecure? Or do you think that that's a problem where you can make them comfortable with it?
Yeah, yeah, in some sense, we have seen the arguments evolve. Like 2 years ago, when we were doing our first pilots, the arguments were, how will you audit? Where's the paper trail? How does the voter know that their intent was honored? And so when we were able to address those questions, now there's a new set of questions. So I think in some sense it is, the bar does keep rising, but we were the first in the space. And so we're not shying away from that. I think that's good that there is scrutiny and criticism. We hope some of it would be more objective and less disruptive, but I think scrutiny is good. It keeps us on our toes and also creates, hopefully puts us on a path to more objective deliberation where we're not speaking in echo chambers. I think sometimes we feel like a lot of the security conversation happens in an echo chamber, and it doesn't really take into account all the things which Amelia just mentioned or what Emily just mentioned. And so our sort of biggest hope is that by doing these pilots and pushing the ball forward, however slow and painful that may be, that we get to a place where we at least can have a conversation and say, look, before you dismiss something, have a look. There may be different ways to do this, but if we all come together, if we can all come together, like Amelia said, to edit DNA, to send people to the moon, to build, go back, bring back the space shuttles and formally verify software so it cannot be tampered with or hacked, for sure we can come up with a common set of standards like was proposed earlier and use that as a basis to move forward. So I agree with you that there are lots of hurdles and the bar keeps rising, but I think we are not perfect, and so we look to that as inspiration to improve and keep innovating. And so far, I think we've been fortunate enough to have an opportunity to do that, do more and more of these pilots. With each pilot, we learn so much. We recently released some security data, which to the best of our knowledge, no elections company anywhere has ever managed to release. So hopefully these are baby steps which make the conversation more constructive, and we love feedback. Hopefully it's more constructive and less destructive, unlike in the past.
Asia, you said that one of the concerns you had was understanding better the operational aspects of this of e-voting, or at least that they needed that's an area of focus. And I was just thinking about that. And I was wondering, because at the end of the day, this comes to the nuts and bolts of how this will work. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about what it is that you would like to see.
Yeah, sorry, and I meant that for all of voting over time, not just e-voting.
Yeah, yes, I heard you said it at the time, and I understand that now as well.
Yeah, I just would like to comment a little bit on what Nimit just said around the research. I think as far as standards and guidelines go, that they should apply also to the research that's being done. It seems to be a little bit lopsided, and we're looking more on how to break things and not how to solve things. And it would be great to have universities looking at building innovation and solving problems, not just breaking them. And it's something I think we as a country need to improve on. And I read the MIT paper in great detail. And one thing that, there's a few things that I would challenge, but one of the points that are missed in there is a risk assessment on current practices versus what is new, the new solution. So it's it's easy to look at this one solution in a bucket and not look at the holistic strategy of where we're headed as a country. I'm sorry, I forgot your first question.
Well, just you mentioned operational issues and that need to be addressed. So
yeah, so love technology. I am very passionate about it. Listened to a whole bunch of DEF CON talks this weekend. I'm very tired. There was a lot of talk around standards, guidelines, some great conversation around that. There was great conversation around vulnerability disclosure and improving that space, which I was glad to hear. And there was a really great talk too around how are we able to handle the operational aspect of mail-in voting this year. and it may take time to count these votes. The people are going to need to be more patient, asking the hacker community to please don't disclose vulnerabilities the day before an election, right? So
Good luck with that.
yes. So that's where I was headed with that.
Okay. Amelia, can you tell us, I mean, you're in a unique position. Do you see strengths and weaknesses? Could you walk us through I guess I'm counting 3 different ways to vote now, which is mail-in, e-voting, and in-person?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we do all 3, right? So I think I'm one of only maybe 3 jurisdictions in the country that actually does in-person, mail-in, and e-voting. And Asia nailed it. Like her, I went through that MIT paper with a fine-tooth comb, right? I went through that with a fine-tooth comb. I was faced with a decision similar to Secretary Warner, where I had people that were threatening me with bad publicity if I continued to use the Votes platform. And as I went through that, and I actually was on a phone call with those researchers from MIT, the Department of Homeland Security facilitated a phone call with us and these researchers. And I asked them several probing questions about how we currently run elections. They had no clue about how we actually run elections today. There was a handful of things in their paper that I wholeheartedly could just push aside because it was no different than how we run things today. Now, do we run elections perfectly today? No. Is there a perfect way to run elections? No. Has there been voter fraud and voter election prosecution for in-person voting? Yes. Has there been in-person voting with machines? Yes. Has there been fraud with in-person voting with paper? Yes. Has there been fraud with mail-in voting? Yes. I mean, what we're doing now is not perfect, but it's the best that we can do. And when we look at evaluating things, we need to look at, number 1, let's evaluate it compared to what we're currently doing. Number 2, how secure is it compared to what we're currently doing? And number 3, is there a better way? And absolutely, I think that we need to look at this within the realm of possibility. Is it possible for every person to show up at the polls on election day and use paper perfectly? No, it's not. But we have to find a balance between safety and security and serving our people. With vote by mail, I have to tell you, I have an employee who works here in my office, okay? She works here in my office. She has a disability, so she's eligible to utilize mobile voting. So she is signed up to utilize the Votes app in our elections. But because she is an eligible voter, she still gets mailed a ballot, okay? So in November of 2019, she cast her ballot. She never got a ballot in the mail, but she cast her ballot on the Votes app. Last week, the US Postal Service delivered her ballot for November of 2019 election.
Wow.
She was able to cast her ballot using Nimitz's Votes app. And we have a vote by mail counting. Now, does that mean if she didn't get her ballot in the mail, would she not have been able to vote? No, of course not, because we have checks and balances. She had several options. She could contact our office and say, I never got a ballot, and we would send her a new one. That's 1. Number 2, she could show up at the polls on election day. And not only do we have paper at the polls available on election day, but we also have an express vote, which is a machine designed for people with disabilities to be able to vote. Every one of our polling locations has accessible machines for those with disabilities. It has paper at the polls for those that didn't get a ballot or changed something or lost their ballot or their kids thought it was junk mail and threw it away. We have several checks and balances along the way. In this case, her vote by mail ballot did not show up until 6 months after the election was over, but she was able to cast it on her phone, right? So every system we have is going to have vulnerabilities. Every system we have is not perfect. What we as administrators do is we work our best to make this as secure as we can for as many voters as possible with the resources that we've been given.
Let me ask you, you said you've been hearing from folks around your state who are saying, hey, why can't we do this here in this county or in this municipality or in this city? Are you hearing from folks outside of your state?
Oh, absolutely. I get calls from people outside. I get calls from advocacy groups outside our state saying, what laws allow you to do this? And what information can you give to me so that I can bring that to my jurisdiction? I also get a lot of calls from other jurisdictions outside the state because we do vote by mail successfully, because we do mobile voting as well as polling locations. We do get a lot of people asking us, how do you do what you do? And can we do the same? So that's great, which kind of leads me to one other point I wanted to make. One of the things that has built in security to our election system in this country is the fact that the country doesn't have one election vendor. They don't have one election process. Elections are not run at the federal level. There's some very high level regulations at the federal level, but the majority of election law takes place at the state level. And even then, the majority of the election administration takes place at the local level. That actually brings us security. If we implemented broad mobile voting, but we had 25 vendors in the market and every local jurisdiction gets to pick the vendor they choose, a foreign actor couldn't just hack one system and change an election, right? So I think that's something that we want to keep in mind, that when we have a lot of jurisdictions running elections, yes, you can have chaos in some areas. I mean, Broward County, Florida comes up. They had hanging chads, and in 2018, they had issues as well, right? Election administrators can cause chaos, but they can also bring in a level of professionalism, and they bring in a lot of ideas, and that brings security.
Okay, thanks. We have just a few minutes left. I want to just go quickly through the panel, starting with Emily. Anything that you think that we should quickly touch on that we haven't poked during our conversation over the last 45 to 50 minutes?
Thank you, Chris. I would like to foot stomp and slightly expand something that Amelia pointed out. Are we comparing the current option and its level of security and credibility to the new option, or are we comparing this new technologically apparently green field to some unrealistic standard of perfection? I think that's really important, and one particular example hits that home. In many cases, and a very unofficial example of how votes can be returned, like actual completed ballots are returned, is by unencrypted email. If we want to compare the vote solution or Democracy Live or any other solution to unencrypted email, there's really no question as to who wins, right? So we have to look at what we're actually comparing in order to be sure that it's a fair and accurate truth telling.
Okay, thank you. Asia, very quickly, any thoughts, final wrap-up thoughts?
Just all the 3 points I'd highlight that we need to do to make this happen is, the standards and the frameworks, and include research in there, move universities to provide solutions, and keep doing the baby steps, pilots, phases, Nimit.
Okay, thanks. And Nimit?
Thank you, Chris. I think I would echo everybody else on the panel and say that the faster we can come up with a base set of standards, I think that would be really, really helpful for the industry, for putting forward more innovative ideas. So I would really urge the community, all the stakeholders to sort of prioritize that, and wholeheartedly we'd be willing to contribute wherever we are needed. Thank you.
And Amelia?
I think you've had a fantastic panel today. I'm very impressed with Emily and Asia, and as always, Nimit. You guys absolutely were spot on. We need standards, we need solutions, we need to compare this to what we're currently doing. Absolutely could not agree more. And lastly, I think instead of finding new people budding in this, new companies budding in this space, instead of trying to squash each one, I think the industry needs more competition and more solutions that can meet these standards.
Great, thanks. And Perry Ann, if you're there, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Chris. That was a really wonderful conversation. Appreciate you, Chris, moderating that. What a cool opportunity to get to hear directly from elections officials that are on the ground, elections and voter technology experts, to really help set the stage of what the full scope of the challenges are when we talk about voter technology and the potential role blockchain technology has to play in this ecosystem. I really appreciated Amelia's point that a vote not cast changes the outcome of an election just as much as a changed vote. And thanks, Amelia, for that call to action for the industry standards. Absolutely agree and believe that there needs to be a conversation between the public and the private sector. And so many of the most important initiatives throughout the US in technology and innovation has been a public and private sector collaborative effort, whether that's commercializing the internet or putting the man on the moon or building out a safe and secure electronic voting strategy for the United States. That balance between the public and the private sector is absolutely essential. And it's also essential that all populations have the tools that they need to exercise their right to vote. The world's moving forward, technology is moving forward, and voter technology, it has to move forward too, but it needs to be done in a way that does not compromise integrity. So I want to thank all of our speakers for joining us today, for sharing your insights, and thanks to all of our attendees for coming and watching and learning more about this topic with us. For more content hosted by the Chamber of Digital Commerce, we'd like to invite you to Parallel. This is our virtual summit. Our next event for Parallel, episode number 4, titled Surviving and Thriving, will be on September 18th, 2020. You can join at parallelsummit.org. Thanks again for joining us. I look forward to seeing you next month at Parallel.